In 1883, a woman was found trampled to death and, on her body in a nearby bush, were clumps of reddish fur. Large hoof prints were found in the area, but locals were perplexed. A short time later, a large animal careened into a tent in which 2 miners lay sleeping. Though they were unable to identify the beast, again, large hoof prints and tufts of red hair were left behind. After more incidents occurred, the locals finally recognized the large animal as a camel. Soon, people began to report seeing the camel, who one rancher said carried a rider, though the rider appeared to be dead. The next report came from a group of prospectors who saw the camel and while watching him, spied something falling from its back. As the beast moved on, the prospectors went to see what had fallen and discovered a human skull. For the next several years, numerous others spied the camel, who by this time had been dubbed the Red Ghost, carrying its headless rider. However, in 1893, when an Arizona farmer found the red camel grazing in his garden, he shot and killed the beast. By this time, the large camel had shaken free of its dead rider, but still bore the saddle and leather straps with which the corpse had been attached. There was much speculation as to who the mysterious dead rider the camel had carried for several years might have been. One tale alleges that the rider was a young soldier, who was afraid of the camels, and therefore, was having much difficulty in learning how to ride them. In order to teach him how, his fellow soldiers tied him to the top of the beast, determined that he would get over his fear. They then hit the camel on the rump and the beast took off running. Though the soldiers pursued the camel and his rider, the red beast easily outpaced them and escaped into the desert. Neither the camel, nor his helpless rider, were ever seen again. House of Wisdom. The House of Wisdom was a library and translation institute in Abbasid-era Baghdad, Iraq. It was a key institution in the translation movement, and considered to have been a major intellectual center of the Islamic Golden Age. The house was an unrivaled center for the study of humanities and for Islamic science, including Islamic mathematics, Islamic astronomy, Islamic medicine, Islamic alchemy and chemistry, zoology and Islamic geography. Drawing on Persian, Indian and Greek texts including those of Pythagoras, Plato, Aristotle, Hippocrates, Euclid, Plotinus, Galen, Sushruta, Sharaka, Aryabhata, and Brahmagupta, the scholars accumulated a great collection of world knowledge, and built on it through their own discoveries. Along with all other libraries in Baghdad, the House of Wisdom was destroyed during the Mongol invasion of Baghdad, in 1258. It was said that the waters of the Tigris ran black for 6 months with ink from the enormous quantities of books flung into the river. The amount of knowledge lost that year is indescribable. It is even more surprising that while most people are familiar with the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, few know about the loss of the House of Wisdom. Link to wikipedia.org on House of Wisdom. Mary Toft was an English housewife who in 1726 began to give birth to rabbits. Or rather, parts of rabbits, and even during one expulsion, 3 legs of a cat of a tabby color, and 1 leg of a rabbit, the guts were as a cat's and in them were 3 pieces of the backbone of an eel. Her story was that dreaming of animals led to her birthing said animals. The best part of the story is the credulous response of the medical community of the time. She was first examined by her local doctor, John Howard, and under his observation edged the number animal parts over the course of several days. She was then examined by National St. Andre, a physician to the royal house of George I, and George's personal secretary Samuel Molyneux. St. Andre concluded that the rabbits were formed in her fallopian tubes. However, after Mary was brought to London and placed under supervision, the births stopped. Then an investigation showed that her husband had been buying up quantities of young rabbits. Finally, Mary confessed that after a miscarriage she had placed the creatures in her uterus in an attempt to gain fame and fortune. Howard and St. Andre were discredited, and Mary was briefly incarcerated before being released, and later gave birth to a healthy baby girl, Bella, down the Wychl. On April 18, 1943, 4 boys from the town of Sturbridge made a grisly discovery in the area of Hagley Wood, which is part of the Hagley Hall estate located in the Midlands of England. In the area they came across an old hollowed-out Wych hazel tree. One of the boys decided to climb the tree to look inside for nesting birds. What he saw was a decomposing human skull. The boys had a suspicion that the skeleton was human. One of the teenagers discussed the experience weeks later with his father. The police investigated the WICH hazel tree and found not only the human skull, but an almost complete skeleton, a shoe, and some fragments of rotted clothing. During a careful search of the surrounding undergrowth, a severed hand from the body was also discovered buried nearby. Professor James Webster examined the remains at the Home Office Forensic Science Laboratory in England. He determined that the woman was around 35 years old, 5 feet tall, with brown hair and irregular teeth in the lower jaw. She had also given birth at least once. Webster's estimated that she had been dead for at least 18 months before she was found. There were no marks of disease or violence on the body, but her mouth had been stuffed with taffeta, which is a smooth woven fabric. The coroner declared it murder by asphyxiation. Authorities searched through the lists of missing persons, however the uncertainties of war had increased the amount of women reported missing and had forced people to change addresses frequently. The most unusual detail was that despite exhaustive searches through dental records, no trace of the woman was found. Even after a description of the woman and the specific irregularities of her lower jaw were published in dental journals. She also had a tooth removed from the right side of her lower jaw. Towards the end of 1943, strange graffiti began to appear on the walls of empty buildings in various parts of the West Midlands of England. The first graffiti message stated "Who put Luabella down the WICHL?" This message was followed by many other slight variations, which was found on a wall in Birmingham. Over time, the message has appeared all over England, with the majority of them stating "Who put Bella in the WICHL?" The individual who wrote the first message and gave the woman the name Bella is unknown. On August 18, 1999, the phrase was sprayed onto the side of the Wickbury obelisk, which is a monument constructed in 1758 by Lord Lyttelton. Many theories have suggested that the woman's murder shows signs of ritualistic witchcraft. Link to wikipedia.org on Who Put Bella in the WICHL. Ivy League nude posture photos. In the late 1970s, an employee from Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, made a startling discovery in a rarely visited room located in a section of Payne Whitney Gymnasium. The employee discovered a large collection of thousands and thousands of nude pictures. The pictures depicted young men that were profiled from the front, side, and rear position. Upon further investigation of the pictures, something disturbing was reported. It seemed that the people in the photos had a bizarre row of sharp metal pins protruding from their spines. It was discovered that the pictures were part of a strange program that was developed in the United States during the 1940s. The program involved taking nude photos of every incoming freshman who attended certain Ivy League and Seven Sisters colleges. These colleges included Yale, Harvard, Princeton, Vassar, Mount Holyoke, and Wellesley College. The official explanation is that the photos were an attempt to gauge the rate and severity of rickets, scoliosis, and lordosis in the population. The project was run by William Herbert Sheldon and E.A. Houghton, who may have been using the data to support their theory on body types and social hierarchy. These explanations have been highly scrutinized. The United States government took swift action and tracked and burned all of the photographs. Many high-ranking government officials and prominent members of American society were among the people profiled. The program was active from the 1940s to the 1970s. The Ivy League nude posture photos are an extremely touchy subject among U.S. government officials. However, people have released accounts of their experience. The freshmen were summoned to the top floor of the gym and met by a man dressed in white garments. They were ordered to remove all their clothes and metal pins were placed along their spine. The pictures were labeled the posture photos because claims have been made that the metal pins were being used to judge posture. The people whose pins were described as erratic were required to attend posture classes. However, this does not explain why the college students were forced to remove all their clothes and why the event was documented. It seems that this information could have been obtained with only the removal of the shirt. Many people have questioned the official story behind the US Ivy League nude photos. This procedure was not limited to men. Some famous Americans who reportedly had the pictures taken are George Bush, George Pataki, Brandon Tartikoff, Meryl Streep, Hillary Clinton, and Diane Sawyer. Poe. In the 19th century, the famous horror writer, Edgar Allan Poe, wrote a book called The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. It was about 4 survivors of a shipwreck who were in an open boat for many days before they decided to kill and eat the cabin boy whose name was Richard Parker. Some years later, in 1884, the yawl, Mignonette, foundered, with only 4 survivors, who were in an open boat for many days. Eventually the 3 senior members of the crew killed and ate the cabin boy. The name of the cabin boy was Richard Parker. Guardian monk. Joseph Aner was a fairly well-known portrait painter in 19th century Austria who, apparently, was quite an unhappy fellow. He several times attempted suicide. His first attempt was at the young age of 18 when he tried to hang himself, but was interrupted by the mysterious appearance of a Capuchin monk. At age 22 he again tried to hang himself, but was again saved from the act by the very same monk. 8 years later, his death was ordained by others who sentenced him to the gallows for his political activities. Once again, his life was saved by the intervention of the same monk. At age 68, Ager finally succeeded in suicide, a pistol doing the trick. His funeral ceremony was conducted by the same Capuchin monk, a man whose name Ager never even knew. Link to wikipedia.org. Joseph Aner. Sawney Bean was the head of a 48-member clan that lived in Scotland during the 15th or 16th century. He was reportedly executed for the mass murder and cannibalization of over 1,000 people. The story of Sawney Bean appears in the Newgate Calendar, a crime catalogue of the Newgate prison in London. Legend says that the family came to include 8 sons, 6 daughters, 18 grandsons, and 14 granddaughters. The group lived in the mountains and thrived on ambushes and murder. The victims were brought back to their cave, dismembered, and cannibalized. One evening, the clan ambushed a married couple and the man was able to fight off the group with a sword and pistol. He escaped and reported the events to the authorities. It wasn't long before King James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, led a manhunt into the area with a team of 400 men. The group discovered the Beans Cave in Banane Head. It was rife with human remains, having been the scene of hundreds of murders and cannibalistic acts. The clan was captured alive and taken in chains to the Tolbooth jail in Edinburgh, then transferred to Glasgow where they were promptly executed without a trial. Some historians look back on the story and believe Sawney Bean never existed. Read more, link toptns.net on top 10 real events that inspired scary movies. French actress, she used to sleep in a coffin. She was famous as a dramatic actress with many tragic roles. In the 1880s she picked out a coffin for herself because she was going to be sleeping in it forever. However, instead of waiting for her death, she regularly slept in it or laid down in it because, as she said in her autobiography, "In front of the window was my coffin, where I frequently installed myself to learn my lines." Link to wikipedia.org on Sarah Bernhard. Dancing plague of 1518. The outbreak began in July 1518, when a woman, Frau Trophia, began to dance fervently in a street in Strasbourg. This lasted somewhere between 4 to 6 days. Within a week, 34 others had joined, and within a month, there were around 400 dancers. Some of these people eventually died from heart attack, stroke, or exhaustion. Historical documents, including physician notes, cathedral sermons, local and regional chronicles, and even notes issued by the Strasbourg City Council, are clear that the victims danced. It is not known why these people danced to their deaths. As the dancing plague worsened, concerned nobles sought the advice of local physicians, who ruled out astrological and supernatural causes, instead announcing that the plague was a natural disease caused by hot blood. However, instead of prescribing bleeding, authorities encouraged more dancing. In part by opening 2 guild halls and a grain market, and even constructing a wooden stage. The authorities did this because they believed that the dancers would only recover if they danced continuously night and day. To increase the effectiveness of the cure, authorities even paid for musicians to keep the afflicted moving. Some of the dancers were taken to a shrine, where they sought a cure for their affliction. Not OP but bumping with contribution, S. On the 31st of March 1922, 6 inhabitants of a small Bavarian farmstead unofficially named Hinterkaifeck were murdered with a pickaxe. The victims were a family and their housekeeper. The mother, father, daughter, and granddaughter were somehow lured into the barn where they were killed one by one. The murdered then proceeded into the house to kill the housekeeper and the grandson, who were sleeping. The granddaughter was left dying after the assault next to the bodies of her grandparents, and she had ripped her hair out in tufts. The murderer had inhabited the farm for days after they slaughtered its inhabitants. The neighbors saw smoke coming from their chimney. Someone had fed their cattle and had eaten food in the kitchen. The theory of robbery was dismissed when large amounts of money that had been untouched were found in the home. Over 100 possible suspects were questioned, yet not one person was charged and the killer remained unknown. Is this the one you're after? On August 31, 2004, a man was discovered behind a Burger King in Richmond Hill, Georgia. He was found by the managers of the restaurant, lying on the ground inside the stone wall enclosing the dumpsters, in a space between the dumpsters that is accessed by a walk-through used for trash disposal. The dumpster enclosure was behind the Burger King in an area hidden from view from all directions except from the restaurant parking lot. Prolonged exposure to the sun had left him sunburned. He was assumed homeless and taken to a hospital for treatment. Officers who searched the scene found no clothes or wallet to identify the man. According to the manager, there were no weapons found at the scene. Paramedics reported that there were 3 depressions in his head that may indicate blows by a blunt object. When found, he had no memory of who he was, and did not even recognize his own face. He was legally blind with cataracts, indicating he may have been without medical care for some time before he was assaulted. Initially, he was known as BK because he was discovered on the premises of a Burger King. Since then, he has chosen to live under the name Benjamin Kyle and insists that his real first name is Benjamin. Link to wikipedia.org on Benjamin Kyle. Bumping with another. 1955, a string of supposedly connected encounters with gremlin-like extraterrestrial beings. Things that make these particular encounters stand out from your regular tinfoil claims are that there were dozens of eyewitnesses, many of which were not known or related to the 2 families who had the encounters, and some of those were police officers, a state trooper, and even a person who was passing through and lived in another town. The creatures never entered the farmhouse, but would pop up in windows and doorways, were impervious to firearms, and the property was left with significant damage. The families did not financially benefit from their story, nor did they gain a significant amount of fame, and even moved when they were inundated with trespassers wanting to see the site. The Air Force and police officers who investigated, along with civilian ufologists, found no evidence of a hoax, and although they never formally investigated it, the Air Force's Blue Book Department labeled it a hoax. Link to wikipedia.org on Kelly Hopkinsville encounter. Will bumped with contributions. Anyone ever heard of the Medgasser of Mattoon? Most contemporary descriptions of the Medgasser are based on the testimony of Mr. and Mrs. Bird Carney of 1408, Marshall Avenue, the victims of the first Mattoon case to be reported by the media. They described the gasser as being a tall, thin man dressed in dark clothing and wearing a tight-fitting cap. Another report, made some weeks later, described the gasser as being a female dressed as a man. The gasser had also been described as carrying a flit gun, an agricultural tool for spraying pesticide, which he purportedly used to expel the gas. Clarence Hall, his wife, and their 2 children returned from a church service at about 9 a.m. They detected a strong, sweet odor and immediately began to feel weak and nauseated. Police investigating the case discovered that a nail had been pulled from a rear window, near where the gas appeared to be the most concentrated, and presumed that the nail hole had been used to inject it into the house. Another incident occurred on December 27, in which Troutville resident A. Kelly and his mother reported similar signs and symptoms to the Huffman and Hall cases. A 4th and 5th incident occurred on January 10, when Mrs. Moore, a guest in home of Haymaker Town resident Homer Hilton, reported hearing voices outside before gas was injected into the room through a damaged window. The second attack that night was reported in Troutville, at the home of G. Kinsey and good old Carl Tanzler. Carl Tanzler, or sometimes Count Carl von Kozel, February 8, 1877 to July 3, 1952, was a German-born radiologist at the United States Marine Hospital in Key West, Florida, who developed a morbid obsession for a young Cuban-American tuberculosis patient, Elena Milagro Helen de Hoyos, July 31, 1909, October 25, 1931, that carried on well after the disease had caused her death. In 1933, almost 2 years after her death, Tanzler removed Oyos's body from its tomb, and lived with the corpse at his home for 7 years until its discovery by Oyos's relatives and authorities in 1940. One evening in April 1933, Tanzler crept through the cemetery where Oyos was buried and removed her body from the mausoleum, carting it through the cemetery after dark on a toy wagon, and transporting it to his home. He reportedly said that Elena's spirit would come to him when he would sit by her grave and serenade her corpse with a favorite Spanish song. He also said that she would often tell him to take her from the grave. Tanzler attached the corpse's bones together with wire and coat hangers, and fitted the face with glass eyes. As the skin of the corpse decomposed, Tanzler replaced it with silk cloth soaked in wax and plaster of Paris. As the hair fell out of the decomposing scalp, Tanzler fashioned a wig from Oyos's hair that had been collected by her mother and given to Tanzler not long after her burial in 1931. Tanzler filled the corpse's abdominal and chest cavity with rags to keep the original form, dressed Oyos's remains in stockings, jewelry, and gloves, and kept the body in his bed. Tanzler also used copious amounts of perfume, disinfectants, and preserving agents, to mask the odor and forestall the effects of the corpse's decomposition. Hard to believe but is true. Swedish twins Ursula and Sabina Eriksson had no history of mental illness and lived normal, happy lives with their respective families. Then, one day, Ursula traveled from the US to Ireland to visit her sister, and what followed was a spree of violence and shared madness that resulted in several traffic accidents, one murder victim, and a whole bunch of baffled cops. Sabina and Ursula were in Ireland when, for unknown reasons, they hopped on a bus to London without telling anyone. The twins were apparently behaving like hooligans whose team had just lost, so the driver kicked them out in the middle of the highway and told them to walk it off. They did just that. They started walking in the middle of the highway, not giving a shit about the speeding cars. At this point they ran into a group of officers who were being filmed for a cops-like show for the BBC. The cameras captured every batshit insane moment that came after that. The video that follows at times looks staged as hell, but it isn't. There's a real murder conviction to prove it. That's just how British people talk. Link to the documentary http://youtube.be/0bisjkpm. Diet Love Pass Incident was a mysterious event which resulted in the deaths of 9 ski hikers in the northern Ural Mountains on the night of February 2, 1959. The incident happened on the east shoulder of the mountain Kalatsyakl, a Mansi name, meaning Mountain of the Dead. The mountain pass where the incident occurred has since been named Diet Love Pass, after the group's leader, Igor Dyatlov. The lack of eyewitnesses has inspired much speculation. Soviet investigators simply determined that a compelling natural force had caused the deaths. Access to the area was barred for skiers and other adventurers for 3 years after the incident. The chronology of the incident remains unclear because of the lack of survivors. Investigators at the time determined that the hikers tore open their tent from within, departing barefoot into heavy snow and a temperature of -30 degrees Celsius -22 degrees Fahrenheit. Although the corpses showed no signs of struggle, 2 victims had fractured skulls, 2 had broken ribs, and 1 was missing her tongue. Devil's footprints. On the night of 8 to February 9, 1855, and 1 or 2 later nights, after a light snowfall, a series of hoof-like marks appeared in the snow. These footprints, measuring 1.5 to 2.5 inches wide and 8 inches apart, continued throughout the countryside for a total of over 100 miles, and, although veering at various points, for the greater part of their course followed straight lines. Houses, rivers, haystacks, and other obstacles were traveled straight over, and footprints appeared on the tops of snow-covered roofs and high walls which lay in the footprints' path, as well as leading up to and exiting various drain pipes of as small as a 4-inch diameter. There were also attendant rumors about sightings of a devil-like figure in the Devon area during the scare. Many townspeople armed themselves and attempted to track down the beast responsible, without success. Recently, on the night of March 12, 2009, more strange marks, corresponding to those left in 1855, were found again in Devon. These new footprints are shown above. Link to wikipedia.org on Devil's Footprints. SS Aurang Medan. In February 1948, distress calls were picked up by numerous ships near Indonesia, from the Dutch freighter SS Aurang Medan. The chilling message was, All officers including captain are dead, lying in chart room and bridge. Possibly whole crew dead. This message was followed by indecipherable Morse code, then one final grisly message. I die. When the first rescue vessel arrived on the scene a few hours later, they tried to hail the Orang Medan, but there was no response. A boarding party was sent to the ship, and what they found was a frightening sight that has made the Orang Medan one of the strangest and scariest ghost ship stories of all time. All the crew and officers of the Orang Medan were dead, their eyes open, faces looking towards the sun, arms outstretched and a look of terror on their faces. Even the ship's dog was dead, found snarling at some unseen enemy. When nearing the bodies in the boiler room, the rescue crew felt a chill, though the temperature was near 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The decision was made to tow the ship back to port, but before they could get underway, smoke began rolling up from the hull. The rescue crew left the ship and barely had time to cut the tow lines before the Orang Medan exploded and sank. To this day, the exact fate of the Orang Medan and her crew remains a mystery. The dancing one reminded me of this. Probably everyone here knows about it, as it only happened 2 years ago. Beginning in August 2011, 14 students, 13 girls and 1 boy, from the Leroy Junior Senior High School began reporting myriad perplexing medical symptoms, including verbal outbursts, tics, seizure activity, and speech difficulty. Following a thorough workup by local doctors and investigations by independent medical specialists, a number of different diagnoses were applied to describe the symptoms, including Tourette syndrome, hysteria, and conversion disorder. Several of the teenage girls were interviewed on national television describing their symptoms and difficulty functioning in day-to-day life. Unsatisfied with the results of the investigation, victims and their parents spoke out publicly against a diagnosis of conversion disorder, stating that they believed the situation warranted further scrutiny from outside sources. Aaron Brockovich, noted environmental activist, speculated that a chemical spill of 1970 might be related to the symptoms the teenagers were experiencing. Brockovich and her team traveled to Leroy in January 2012 to investigate further. Soil and well water testing began on January 29, 2012 at the site of the 1970 spill and surrounding areas, which include the nearby high school. On January 31, it was reported that school officials barred Brockovich and her team from collecting soil samples on school grounds, and subsequently issued security directives to supporting local law officials to prevent any unauthorized testing in the area. Link to wikipedia.org on Leroy Village, New York. Here's a good one. The first alleged sightings of spring-heeled Jack were made in London in 1837, and the last reported sighting is said in most of the secondary literature to have been made in Liverpool in 1904. According to much later accounts, in October 1837, a girl by the name of Mary Stevens was walking to Lavender Hill, where she was working as a servant, after visiting her parents in Battersea. On her way through Clapham Common, a strange figure leapt at her from a dark alley. After immobilizing her with a tight grip of his arms, he began to kiss her face, while ripping her clothes and touching her flesh with his claws, which were, according to her deposition, cold and clammy as those of a corpse. In panic, the girl screamed, making the attacker quickly flee from the scene. The commotion brought several residents, who immediately launched a search for the aggressor, who could not be found. The next day, the leaping character is said to have chosen a very different victim near Mary Stevens' home, inaugurating a method that would reappear in later reports. He jumped in the way of a passing carriage, causing the coachman to lose control, crash, and severely injure himself. Several witnesses claimed that he escaped by jumping over a 9 feet, 2.7 meters, high wall while babbling with a high-pitched, ringing laughter. Gradually, the news of the strange character spread, and soon the press and the public gave him a name, Spring-Heeled Jack. Link to wikipedia.org on Spring-Heeled Jack. That's why I love these threads. Stuff like this is actually creepy. Gloria Ramirez, about 8:15 in the evening on February 19, 1994, Ramirez, suffering from the effects of advanced cervical cancer, was brought into the emergency room of Riverside General Hospital by paramedics. She was extremely confused, and suffering from bradycardia and Cheney-Stokes respiration. The medical staff injected her with Valium, Versed, and Ativan to sedate her. When it became clear that Ramirez was responding poorly to treatment, the staff tried to defibrillate her heart. At that point several people saw an oily sheen covering Ramirez's body, and some noticed a fruity, garlic-like odor that they thought was coming from her mouth. A registered nurse named Susan Kane attempted to draw blood from Ramirez's arm, and noticed an ammonia-like smell coming from the tube. She passed the syringe to Julie Gorkinski, a medical resident who noticed manila-colored particles floating in the blood. At this point, Kane fainted and was removed from the room. Shortly thereafter, Dr. Gorkinski began to feel nauseated. Complaining that she was lightheaded, she left the trauma room and sat at a nurse's desk. A staff member asked her if she was okay, but before she could respond she also fainted. Maureen Welch, a respiratory therapist who was assisting in the trauma room, was the third to pass out. The staff was then ordered to evacuate all emergency room patients to the parking lot outside the hospital. A skeleton crew stayed behind to stabilize Ramirez. At 8:50 p.m., after 45 minutes of CPR and defibrillation, Ramirez was pronounced dead from kidney failure related to her cancer. Link to wikipedia.org on Gloria Ramirez. Not paranormal but still creepy. I remember seeing a documentary on this with a guy talking about scooping his dead daughter up in his arms and barely making it out on a bike. Lake Nyos is a crater lake in the northwest region of Cameroon, located about 315 kilometers, 196 miles, northwest of Yaoundé. Nyos is a deep lake high on the flank of an inactive volcano in the Oka volcanic plain along the Cameroon line of volcanic activity. A volcanic dam impounds the lake waters. A pocket of magma lies beneath the lake and leaks carbon dioxide, CO2, into the water, changing it into carbonic acid. Nyos is one of only 3 known exploding lakes to be saturated with carbon dioxide in this way, the others being Lake Manaun, also in Cameroon, and Lake Kivu in Democratic Republic of Congo. On August 21, 1986, possibly as the result of a landslide, Lake Nyos suddenly emitted a large cloud of CO2, which suffocated 1,700 people and 3,500 livestock in nearby towns and villages. Though not completely unprecedented, it was the first known large-scale asphyxiation caused by a natural event. To prevent a recurrence, a degassing tube that siphons water from the bottom layers of water to the top, allowing the carbon dioxide to leak in safe quantities, was installed in 2001, and 2 additional tubes were installed in 2011. Link to wikipedia.org on Lake Nyos. On the 26th of May 1828, a teenage boy appeared on the streets of Nuremberg, Germany. He carried with him a letter that was addressed to the captain of the 4th Squadron of the 6th Cavalry Regiment, Captain von Wessenig. Its heading read, Von der Bayerischen Grand/Das Ordist Unbenannt /1828, from the Bavarian border / the place is unnamed /1828. The anonymous author said that the boy was given into his custody as an infant on October 7, 1812, and that he instructed him in reading, writing and the Christian religion, but never let him take a single step out of my house. The letter stated that the boy would now like to be a cavalryman, as his father was, and invited the captain either to take him in or to hang him. At first it was assumed that he was raised half wild in forests, but during many conversations with Mayor Binder, Hauser told a different version of his past life, which he later also wrote down in more detail. 5. According to this story, for as long as he could remember he spent his life totally alone in a darkened cell about 2 meters long, 1 meter wide and 1.5 high, with only a straw bed to sleep on and a horse carved out of wood for a toy. He claimed that he found bread and water next to his bed each morning. Periodically the water would taste bitter and drinking it would cause him to sleep more heavily than usual. On such occasions, when he awakened, his straw was changed and his hair and nails were cut. Hauser claimed that the first human being with whom he ever had contact was a mysterious man who visited him not long before his release, always taking great care not to reveal his face to him. This man, Hauser said, taught him to write his name by leading his hand. After learning to stand and walk, he was brought to Nuremberg. Link to wikipedia.org on Caspar Hauser. And to keep the thread going, Christine Chubbuck, August 24, 1944 to July 15, 1974, was an American television news reporter who committed suicide during a live television broadcast. The film reel of the restaurant shooting had jammed and would not run, so Chubbuck shrugged it off and said on camera, in keeping with Channel 40's policy of bringing you the latest in blood and guts, and in living color. You are going to see another first attempted suicide. She drew the revolver and shot herself behind her right ear. Chubbuck fell forward violently and the technical director faded rapidly to black. Camera operator Jean Reed later recalled she thought it had been an elaborate prank and did not realize Chubbuck had actually shot herself until she saw Chubbuck's twitching body. Link to wikipedia.org on Christine Chubbuck. This has always been one of my favorites. On the 10th of August, 1901, two women, Charlotte Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain, arrived at the Palace of Versailles, and after taking a tour and not thinking much of it, they decided to visit the Petit Trianon, a chateau located on the grounds of the palace. Although they were traveling with a guidebook, they missed a turn off and walked down a lane where Moberly noticed a woman shaking a white cloth out of her window and Jourdain noticed an old deserted farmhouse with a plow out the front of it. At this point they claim a great feeling of oppression and dreariness came over them. Then they saw some men which they assumed were palace gardeners, and Moberly later described them as being very dignified officials, describing their dress. Jourdain noticed a cottage with a woman holding a jug out to a girl. Moberly didn't witness this cottage, but it was at that point that she claims the atmosphere changed. She wrote, "Everything suddenly looked unnatural, therefore unpleasant, even the trees seemed to become flat and lifeless, like wood worked in tapestry. There were no effects of light and shade, and no wind stirred the trees." They reached the edge of a wood, close to the Temple de l'Amour, and came across a man seated beside a garden kiosk, wearing a cloak and large shady hat. According to Moberly, his appearance was most repulsive, its expression odious. His complexion was dark and rough. Jourdain noted the man slowly turned his face, which was marked by smallpox. His complexion was very dark. The expression was evil and yet unseeing, and though I did not feel that he was looking particularly at us, I felt a repugnance to going past him. A man later described as tall, with large dark eyes, and crisp curling black hair under a large sombrero hat, came up to them, and showed them the way to the Petit Trianon. Portrait of Marie Antoinette by Wertmuller. The figure that Moberly saw near the Petit Trianon was claimed to bear a resemblance to the Queen as depicted in this painting. After crossing a bridge, they reached the gardens in front of the palace, and Moberly noticed a lady sketching on the grass who looked at them. She later described what she saw in great detail. The lady was wearing a light summer dress, on her head was a shady white hat, and she had lots of fair hair. Moberly thought she was a tourist at first, but the dress appeared to be old-fashioned. Moberly came to believe that the lady was Marie Antoinette. Jourdain, however, did not see the lady. After this, they were directed round to the entrance and joined a party of other visitors. They later published a book detailing their experience after studying the history of the palace and attempting many times to retrace the route they had taken that day. Most notably was the bridge they claimed to have crossed. They couldn't find it again, and though it wasn't marked on any current maps of the palace, was found to be on a really old map of the grounds that they discovered. Link to paranormalnewscentral.com on top 10 weird coincidences. 10. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, an 18th century German poet, was riding on the road to Drusenheim. Riding toward him was someone who looked exactly like him, but wearing a gray suit trimmed in gold. 8 years later, von Goethe was again traveling on the same road, but in the opposite direction. He then realized he was wearing the very gray suit trimmed in gold that he had seen his double wear 8 years earlier. 9. While American novelist Anne Parrish was browsing bookstores in Paris in the 1920s, she came upon a book that was one of her childhood favorites entitled Jack Frost and Other Stories. She immediately showed it to her husband, remarking that the story had been one of her favorites as a little girl. Her husband opened the book and was stunned to read the inscription inside, Anne Parrish, 209 N. Weber Street, Colorado Springs, Colorado. As it turns out, the book was the one she had as a child. 8. In 1858, Robert Fallon was shot dead, an act of vengeance by those with whom he was playing poker. Fallon, they claimed, had won the $600 pot through cheating. With Fallon's seat empty and none of the other players willing to take the now unlucky $600, they found a new player to take Fallon's place and staked him with the dead man's $600. By the time the police had arrived to investigate the killing, the new player had turned the $600 into $2,200 in winnings. The police demanded the original $600 to pass on to Fallon's next of kin, only to discover that the new player turned out to be Fallon's son, who had not seen his father in 7 years. 7. Mark Twain was a popular American author who wrote such books as The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. Mark Twain was born on the day of the appearance of Halley's Comet in 1835, and died on the day of its next appearance in 1910. He himself predicted this in 1909, when he said, "I came in with Halley's Comet in 1835. It is coming again next year, and I expect to go out with it." 6. Henry Ziegland thought he had dodged fate. In 1883, he broke off a relationship with his girlfriend who, out of distress, committed suicide. The girl's brother was so enraged that he hunted down Ziegland and shot him. The brother, believing he had killed Ziegland, then turned his gun on himself and took his own life. But Ziegland had not been killed. The bullet, in fact, had only grazed his face and then lodged in a tree. Ziegland surely thought of himself as a lucky man. Some years later, however, Ziegland decided to cut down the large tree, which still had the bullet in it. The task seemed so formidable that he decided to blow it up with a few sticks of dynamite. The explosion propelled the bullet into Ziegland's head, killing him. 5. In 1975, while riding a moped in Bermuda, a man was accidentally struck and killed by a taxi. 1 year later, this man's father was killed in the very same way. In fact, he was riding the very same moped. And to stretch the odds even further, he was struck by the very same taxi driven by the same driver, and even carrying the very same passenger. 4. An article in the January 1980 edition of Reader's Digest reported the strange lives of identical twin boys, separated at birth in Ohio, and adopted by different families. 40 years later, the boys were reunited and discovered that their lives had been amazingly parallel. Both boys were named James. Both trained in law enforcement. Both had abilities in mechanical drawing and carpentry. They both married women named Linda, had sons named James Allen and James Allen, respectively. Both brothers later divorced and both remarried women named Betty. They both owned dogs named Toy. 3. In the 19th century, the famous horror writer, Edgar Allan Poe, wrote a book called The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. It was about 4 survivors of a shipwreck who were in an open boat for many days before they decided to kill and eat the cabin boy whose name was Richard Parker. Some years later, in 1884, the Yawl Mignonette foundered with only 4 survivors and were in an open boat for many days. Eventually, the 3 senior members of the crew killed and ate the cabin boy. The name of the cabin boy was Richard Parker. 2. Then comes the lives of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, 2 of America's founders. Jefferson crafted the Declaration of Independence, showing drafts of it to Adams, who, with Benjamin Franklin, helped to edit and hone it. The Continental Congress approved the document on July 4, 1776. Surprisingly, both Jefferson and Adams died on the same day, July 4, 1826, until exactly 50 years from the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The next one is the most mind-blowing case of coincidence I've ever come across. If true, this should be a subject of intense scientific inquiry because the claim of coincidence is less believable than the idea that something beyond our understanding is at work. 1. In Monza, Italy, King Umberto I went to a small restaurant for dinner, accompanied by his aide-de-camp, General Emilio Ponzi of Aglia. When the owner took King Umberto's order, the king noticed that he and the restaurant owner were virtual doubles, in face and in build. Both men began discussing the striking resemblance between each other and found many more similarities. Both men were born in the same place, on the same day, of the same year, March 14, 1844, Turin, Italy. On the day that the king married Queen Margherita, the restaurant owner had married a lady named Margherita. The restaurateur opened his restaurant on the same day that King Umberto was crowned King of Italy. On the July 29, 1900, King Umberto was informed that the restaurateur had died that day in a mysterious shooting accident, and as he expressed his regret, an anarchist in the crowd then assassinated him. David Booth had a vivid recurring dream 10 nights in a row. He dreamt of an American Airlines flight taking off on a sunny day, its nose pointing straight up but making a noise that didn't seem right. The plane suddenly banked to one side, dived toward the ground, and exploded in an enormous ball of fire. Each time, David awoke from this dream full of overwhelming despair. Plagued by the notion he should do something about this and knowing he might be dismissed as another kook, David nonetheless contacted the FAA and recounted his dream at an official over the phone. Without details regarding a specific place and time, there was nothing anyone could do. On the morning of May 25, 1979, David awoke with the certainty he would never have this dream again. It was on that very day American Airlines Flight 191 crashed in a field near the runway at O'Hare Airport shortly after takeoff. The incident happened in a manner that the 30-year FAA official who has spoken to David Booth would later describe as eerily accurate. Out-of-place artifact, OOP art, is a term coined by American naturalist and cryptozoologist Yvonne T. Sanderson for an object of historical, archaeological, or paleontological interest found in a very unusual or seemingly impossible context that could challenge conventional historical chronology by being too advanced for the level of civilization that existed at the time, or showing human presence far before humans were supposed to exist. Link to wikipedia.org on out-of-place artifact. The Owlman story began when paranormal researcher Tony Doc Shields was approached by a man, Don Melling, who had been visiting the area on holiday from Lancaster. Melling said that on April 17, 1976, his two daughters, 12-year-old June and her 9-year-old sister, Vicky, were walking through the woods near Monon Church when they saw a large winged creature hovering above the church tower. The girls were frightened and immediately ran to tell their father. According to Shields, the family had become so perturbed by the sighting that they had abandoned their holiday 3 days early and that the father would not allow either of his daughters to be interviewed. Shields was, however, provided with a drawing of the creature made by 12-year-old June. 2 months later, on July 3, 14-year-old Sally Chapman was camping with a friend, Barbara Perry, in woods near the church. According to her account, as she stood outside her tent, she heard a hissing sound and turned to see a figure that looked like an owl as big as a man, with pointed ears and red eyes. The girls reported that the creature flew up into the air, revealing black pincer-like claws. Sightings of this figure continued to be reported on the following day, when it was described as silvery gray, and on 2 occasions 2 years later, in June and August 1978, all within the vicinity of the church. The children, brother and sister, were of generally normal appearance except for the green color of their skin. They spoke in an unknown language, and the only food they would eat was beans. Eventually they learned to eat other food and lost their green pallor, but the boy was sickly and died soon after the children were baptized. The girl adjusted to her new life, but she was considered to be rather loose and wanton in her conduct. After she learned to speak English, the girl explained that she and her brother had come from St. Martin's Land, an underground world whose inhabitants are green. Link to wikipedia.org on green children of Woolpit. To be fair, this one is folkloric, but it's a 900-year-old account. It's not a news story from 10 years ago. It sounds plausible enough. The families of British tourists Andrew Redfern and Louis Silo, who had never met and whose sons died under completely different circumstances in 2 different countries, faced a strangely similar problem. Andrew died in October 2006 after falling on his forehead in a hotel lobby in Cuba. Louis died of a heart attack a month earlier, while vacationing in Dublin, Ireland. Andrew was returned to England without his lungs, kidneys, and part of his brain. Louis was sent back with 2 hearts and 4 lungs. The families are still waiting for a believable explanation. I remember seeing this one on Unsolved Mysteries. Donald Decker is a Pennsylvania native who has been surrounded by a phenomenon that enables him to cause rain to appear around him. It started after his grandfather's death when he was a teenager in February of 1983. He arrived at a friend's house, and while he was in the restroom, was attacked by what he later claimed was his grandfather's spirit. It apparently scratched his forearm. Afterwards, they were all in the living room and rain started falling in the house. Don and his friends later went to a cafe, where the rain continued to fall without explanation. Don was on a week's leave from jail to attend his grandfather's funeral while all this was happening. He had been sent to jail for receiving stolen property and he had to go back to jail to finish his sentence. While he was back in jail, he was sent to a priest after causing it to rain in his jail cell. The priest performed several exorcisms and ceremonies on Dawn, and eventually, as mysteriously as the rain began, it stopped forever. The toasty warm skeleton of a 40-year-old woman was found in her small London studio apartment in January 2006. Joyce Vincent was on the floor surrounded by Christmas presents, lying between a space heater and television set. Both appliances still running. Police believed she had been dead for 3 years. She was discovered by housing officials who had come to collect thousands of dollars of overdue rent. A U.S. World War II bomber plane named Lady Be Good crash-landed in the desert in Libya in 1943. 16 years later, oil surveyors from Britain stumbled on the wreckage that had been extraordinarily well preserved by the dry climate. The machine guns, radio, and one of the engines still worked, and there were several containers of fresh water on board. There was, however, no sign of the 9 crew member who had been on this flight. The Air Force did not take this sighting seriously when it was first reported by the oil surveyors. It would be another years before they sent a search team to the site. In 1960, the wreckage and mummified remains of 8 of the 9 crew member were finally located. Parts of Lady Be Good are still on display at the Army Quartermaster Museum in Fort Lee, Virginia. Through the years, night watchmen have reported hearing voices and eerie sounds near the display, and that pieces of the plane often moved by themselves. William Coggett was a death row inmate at San Quentin in the 1930s. Believing he could fashion an execution for himself that was less horrific than any state had in store for him, Coggett unscrewed a hollow steel leg from his cot and packed it tightly with torn pieces of playing cards, which Coggett knew were printed with ink that contained a very volatile material. He poured water into the other end of the tube and placed the device between his head and the gas heater in his cell. As heated water turned into steam, pressure built up in the tube. The ensuing explosion was powerful enough to blow a hole through Coggett's skull, in effect making him the first prisoner to execute himself using a pipe bomb, and perhaps the only person ever to blow his brains out with a deck of playing cards. Dwarf of Zaragoza incident. In the town of Zaragoza in Spain, the voice of an entity began manifesting itself, with the stove furnace as the source. It made loud noises and vulgarly insulted those who tried to make contact with it. It got to the point that police were called to intervene, with an extensive investigation on part of technicians and detectives to see if the voice was coming from the pipes or drainage. The police made contact with it, and it revealed in a conversation that it was not human. After months of desperation, the police charged the maid of the house, without any evidence, and had the house torn down, after which the dwarf stopped manifesting.